Have you ever wanted to drive a narrow gauge train up to service a copper mine deep in the mountains? And do you remember in part 3 of this series when we were switching in Delta Yard in Everett, wondering what it would be like to drive one of those narrow gauge trains in the background? If so, this video is for you. Welcome to part 4 of my continuing series of videos about train operations on the Burlington Northern Railroad. I'm Burr Stewart. I'm the layout owner and builder of an HO scale model railroad depicting the Seattle area in approximately the year 1973. Now, as you know, the Burlington Northern was not operating narrow gauge steam in 1973. But this is a model railroad. And in my imagination, the Denver and Rio Grande Western, instead of eliminating all its narrow gauge lines, decided to try competing with the standard gauge lines, and by the 70s had run an extension all the way up to Everett, Washington from its westernmost point in Montrose, Colorado. After all, why did they call it the Denver and Rio Grande Western? Isn't Everett as western as you can get? So while you ponder that, let's get back to running trains. What we're going to do today is pick up 4 empty gondola cars, take them up to the Cascade Copper Mine in the Cascade Mountains, and return with 4 loaded cars. What you're seeing here is Microtrain's HOn3 couplers at their best. We drove the engine right up onto the cars and reversed and pulled the cars out without a fuss. Now you can see perhaps the worst feature of these couplers, which is that there's a lot of slack between the cars and they tend to bunch up in a strange looking way in certain conditions. You can see I just flicked the points of those stock micro engineering HOn3 turnouts, whose points are spring loaded, so there's no need to put a separate switch machine there. Normally we would have to run around the caboose in order to tack it on the end of the gondola cars, but since we're in a hurry today, I'm going to spare you that runaround move, and we'll just move right up to the head end of the train, couple up, take on water, and move on up to the mine. This locomotive is a stock Blackstone K-27, and we'll see when we get up to the mine just how much pulling power it may or may not have. The main view is being shot by an iPhone 10. And the inset view is being shot by a Casio V50 action cam sitting on the track. Oops, looks like the engine just hit the camera, but all is well. That water tank in the distance that we'll be filling our tender with shortly is an old fine scale miniatures kit that one of my high school friends built in the 1960s, and the two of us have been playing with trains ever since, showing that model railroading truly is a lifetime hobby. We have our train together, so we'll wait briefly for our train instructions and then head up to the water tank. That's a nice looking little train. When I started making this video, I thought, how long can it take to run up to the mine, pick up the loads, and run back to the yard? Turns out it's going to take us quite a while, almost an hour. We'll stop here for a moment and take on water. To get to the first town, which is called Paradise, the main line wraps around a one-turn helix and emerges at a level that's about 7 inches above the Delta yard. You can see here that we've come around the helix and are now back out in the open scenery, which is somewhat temporary, but better than nothing. An excursion train is waiting for us at what will someday be a grade crossing. The mountain in the backdrop there is called Mount Bering in the Cascade Range, which is near a really nice hiking spot called Barkley Lake. If you're sitting at the lake, that vertical cliff on the left of the mountain just rises straight up. We'll stop here for train orders at Paradise, and while we're waiting, I want to show you some footage from the real D&RGW steam engines. We're just sitting, waiting to start. It's a lot noisier than what we're used to on a model railroad. Well, it looks like we got our clearance to proceed. Paradise is a nice little switching town with several industries, a saloon, a house track and a team track. We'll come back and do some switching here some other time. Mountain in the backdrop is Glacier Peak, one of the volcanic peaks in the Cascade Range. And the trestle in the foreground was my first ever Campbell kit I built when I was about 14 years old, again in the 1960s. This trestle originally was a standard gauge, but I re-gauged it to narrow gauge for the purposes of this present layout. Now we seem to have climbed up into elk country. But they don't seem to mind the family of hikers so nearby. We're coming up to a switch called Vale Junction in honor of the late Jim Vale, who was a very famous and wonderful HOn3 modeler in the Bay Area. The upper route leads to the town of Hope and beyond, and the route that we're taking towards the left is a switchback down to the mine, which you see in the lower left-hand corner of the photo. Now that we're going downhill, I guess we can speed up a little or we'll never get this job done. I think Jim Vale would have approved of the way that this layout is hung along the wall, and we have a lot of trackage with a very small amount of scenery. He did the same thing on his spectacular layout. I haven't designed a lot of the scenery in this area, but I look forward to doing so. Snow sheds, tunnels, the whole bit. On the upper level you get a glimpse of the town of Hope, and we'll go and switch that town in some other video. There's a pretty wicked reverse curve right here, and one of these days I'll go in and make a repair to it. You'll see when we come back out that it causes a problem with coupler heights. One of the advantages of using 1/4-inch plywood for sub-roadbed like this is it's easy to carry, easy to saw, and easy to install. But the disadvantage is you can get pretty bad vertical curves at times. There's that bucking action again that you see with these micro trains HOn3 couplers. Well, now our train has entered the siding at the Cascade Copper Company mine. And so we'll do a bunch of switching to pull out the loads and put in the empties and eventually head back home. Our first move is to put the caboose out on the tail track. I haven't had time to finish that mine building or the scenery around the track, but it's so much fun to operate that we'll get to that later. Oops, there's a bit of a grade on this siding. I'm going to have to put in some little brush weeds in between the ties and see if I can restrict the amount of rolling that goes on during these switching moves, because it creates clearance problems at the fouling points. This track I just put down fairly quickly, and I didn't put in any frog juicers or anything, so I had some electrical issues with the locomotive in this spot, which is why you see the jerky movements occasionally in the video. The track in this area is not glued down yet because I'm still designing the scenery, and as you'll see, that causes quite a problem in a minute. There was a boxcar of supplies that was also on the mine track, so we decided to take that with us on the return trip. But I am not sure why I pulled out the boxcar without the gondolas connected to it. The clearance is a little too tight here, so I got to go fix that. Oops! Didn't mean to dump that car on the ground. I guess that's the price I pay for having operations on track that isn't glued down and doesn't have clearance with adjacent tracks. Well, I guess our engine crew has decided to pretend like nothing happened and just keep going on, picking up our 4 loaded gondolas. Well, all we need to do now is shove the loaded cars onto the caboose on the tail track and then put the empty cars by the mine. Ouch! I'm glad I wasn't the conductor sitting in that caboose. We're supposed to stop the train, gently hook onto the caboose, and then push it, not just slam into it like that. It really amazes me how long all this takes. I guess on the real railroad, this would have been a whole day's job, and we're trying to shove it into a quick YouTube video. Now let's see if we can do this without jostling the conductor so much. Not so fast. In order for us to go back, we have to have the engine on the right side and the caboose on the left side of this train. So we're going to have to do a runaround maneuver. First, we'll push the caboose back past the switch point, and then we'll run around and tack the caboose on the left end of the train, and then run around with the engine so we can push the train up the steep part of the switchback. Caboose first. These gondola cars are loaded with copper ore in a method called loose loads, meaning I simply poured the crushed rock into the cars. The problem, as we saw, of course, is that if they derail and tip over, the loose loads spill all over the layout. On the other hand, if you glue the loads to a piece of wood, then you look at the same load every single time. There's no variation in the loading. There's no one right answer. Like many things in model railroading and in life. Now that was more like it. Wouldn't you like to know what those two moose are talking to each other about up at the top of the switchback there? Well, we've got our train together. Now the question is, do we have enough traction to get this whole train up that steep 3% grade, or are we going to have to double the hill? Looks like wheel slip to me. Well, this is a real situation. The only way we can get this train back up over the hill is a maneuver called doubling the hill, which means we're going to have to cut the train in half and take each half up separately. Here we're tying down the brakes so that we can leave these last 3 cars in the caboose on the grade while we run the engine around the first 2 cars. With cars this small and light, it's hard not to flick them around a bit when you uncouple. Ooch, that turnout looks a bit rough. I'll have to go back with the file and check it out. All right, here we go up the switchback with section 1. We've never had enough operators here at an operating session to run both the narrow gauge and the standard gauge at the same time. But the guy who normally runs the Delta yard is a narrow gauge buff. So if he gets some slack time, he has been known to run engines up and down the switchback just for fun, just like we're doing today. If you're familiar with the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railway in Chama, New Mexico, back in the early days when that was Denver and Rio Grande Western, they used to double and even triple the hill regularly because they had a 4% grade eastbound out of Chama. And so they would take sometimes 50-car trains up to the top of the hill in 10 or 15-car segments. And they had 3 passing tracks at the top of the hill, so they could park the train in increments as they got it up there. And then when they got the whole train up to the top of the hill, they'd just use one locomotive for the downhill portion all the way back down into Antonito. You can hear that tortoise switch machine popping over the switch so that we can park the rear half of the train on the main line temporarily while we go back down and get the other 2 cars. I jammed a railroad tie in between the car and the track there just to temporarily hold those, but now that I see that this is necessary, I might go in and put some more permanent way of breaking the cars there in place. This section of the switchback will be a lot more interesting to run on once I get in some vertical scenery elements like snow sheds, tunnels, trees, rocks. I just quickly put this section of the layout together in order to get some operations going on the narrow gauge, but I look forward to coming back and fixing this up in the future. I have noticed that headlight keeps coming on and off every time we change direction. I don't know how realistic that is, and in most of my locomotives, I remap the decoders so that you can turn the headlights on and off independently of the direction of motion, which would be more typically what an engineer would see in their locomotive cab. When we get back to the standard gauge videos in this series, you'll see that many of my standard gauge locomotives, the headlights stay on regardless of direction. We stop here one final time to get our clearance to head home and to give the brakeman a chance to go flip that switch on the front end of the siding. Oh, did you catch that? The vertical curve right there was so severe it lifted the locomotive coupler up and the two cars felt loose and ran away. Fortunately, I was right there with the uncoupling pick to stop it. That square hole in the upper left-hand corner of the photo is the end of track for the narrow gauge. After it leaves Hope, it wraps another time around in a helix, and I plan to extend the track into another town or two. Who knew it would take this many moves just to bring 4 loaded cars from the mine back to the town? That was an unexpected time saver. The railroad tie that was propping those cars up just fell down when the approaching cars hit it. So I didn't have to engage in a complex uncoupling maneuver there. Those cliffs right next to the caboose look very suspiciously like blue foam that I haven't yet patched from a previous repair job. Any excuse to blow the horn will do. I've heard that short toots when you're crossing a trestle is sometimes viewed as a safety measure. Well, we've arrived in paradise one more time, and we'll stop again for train orders briefly. I do enjoy the model locomotive train whistles, but let me show you what the real thing sounds like. The following recording was taken the last time I was visiting the cumbersome Toltec Scenic Railroad. Woo! You just have to imagine all that smoke and steam coming out of this little beast. Quick work for our hypothetical brakeman. Well, there you have it. What would be simpler than just taking some empty cars up to the mine and bringing back the loads? When I started this, I had no idea that we would take almost an hour to accomplish this. But it's been great fun, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'll spare you the final details, but of course we need to run around the train, pick up that caboose, put the caboose away, store the loaded cars in the yard, and put the engine away. But we can let the ground crew do that here in Chama. I mean Delta. We'll just put the engine back where we found it and call it good. It's been a long day working on the railroad. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and stay tuned for our next installment, which will probably be about handling unit grain trains in and out of Seattle on the standard gauge Burlington Northern Railroad set in 1973. Until then, this is your host, Burr Stewart, wishing you much fun with trains.